for innovation and automation technologies for agricultural research systems. And he'll be speaking today on transformation of official solutions through electrification. John.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to talk at this important conference. And I'm going to cover some historical aspects of electrification. I'm going to talk a lot about off-road, but primarily on farm electrification. And then I'm going to give some examples that have happened in the machinery industry for electrified systems and where it's at today. And talk a little bit, show some future concepts, and then and close out with a few comments about the farm of the future and electrification. So first, let's give a historical perspective of farm electrification. 100 years ago, most cities had electricity, but in 1932, only 10% of farms had electricity, if you think about that, and all the things we have today. And that resulted later in the Rural Electrification Act, and its purpose was to help build the infrastructure for these rural areas. And what was created was a government agency tasked with providing low-cost loans for the construction of electrical distribution systems, and it financed the installation of power lines, transformers, and before the Rural Electrification Act existed, many people, if they had electricity in rural areas, it was because they self-funded and extended it. So this basically was a time where rural Americans did not have lights, refrigeration, and other modern conveniences. And the current farm of today is very much driven by the impact of this act, and it's basically helped break down the urban-rural divide with respect to electrification. Some interesting facts about REA is that it didn't just pay the individuals to create this, but created cooperatives that could access the money, get loans to build the infrastructure in rural communities, and those were paid back over a 30-year time period. What I thought was also very interesting is that they used to have tours to try to demonstrate the value of this technology, and some of the tours in the 1930s and 40s even were demonstrating the benefits. And I remember I read one article that said that there more than 200 uses of electricity had been identified. I always find this really fascinating, as much as we expected today, but to imagine that was a research topic at that point in time. In fact, the University of Illinois played a role in this. Louisan E. Mamer, she died in 2005, but she spent her career as a home electrification specialist, teaching rural communities the benefits and uses of electricity on the farm. And so that's a little bit of an aside to what's happening in the agricultural equipment industry, but I think it's very important if you start thinking about the overall ecosystem required to make electrification possible. So I'm going to give a few examples of the benefits of electrification to off-road equipment and some of the current solutions that exist today, as well as some of the concepts that have been shown that are possibilities for the future. In general, over the last 20 years that I've worked in this industry, it's moved from thinking about how electrification can impact efficiencies through auxiliaries, how can we get electrification to implements. A lot of times in agriculture, tractors have trailing implements. There are mild hybrids, and today there's kind of like at the cusp of some full hybrids are emerging, and there's a lot of visibility of battery electric solutions. And we'll go through a few examples of those to try to show some of the benefits. In general, there are value drivers that come from electrification. There's improved performance with the integrated power management, significant efficiency gains, more flexible vehicle architecture, being able to enable new features and functionality. The manufacturing of electrification-based systems is different than traditional manufacturing, and reduced noise is often a benefit in terms of the use of the machinery. Now, I put an asterisk by that because the other thing that I found is taking traditional machinery, pulling the ICE out, which made a lot of noise, and making it electric also revealed new noise sources sometimes, gear noise and rattle, that the ICE was a nice little air cover for that type of thing. But in general, there's opportunities to reduce noise. One of the first platforms that I had experience with is not in ag directly, but it's in commercial fairway mowing. And in this case, it's still an engine-driven machine, but the reels on the front of the machine are driven electrically. And there's a lot of benefits for golf courses. Hydraulic leak points are really a challenging problem. Leaking hydraulics onto the ground of a golf course is a no-no. Actually, there was improvements in the task of mowing because you didn't have a coupling between the reel speed for cutting and the engine speed for propulsion and driving the overall systems. And so you could throttle back and get the same cutting performance, which resulted in a quieter environment for the use of the machine. And actually, it was really an opportunity to improve the maintenance of the cutting reels. You can imagine these devices that are on the front with the black boxes around them, the cutting reels. And in hydraulic systems, you wouldn't really commonly, you'd have to have quick hit disconnect or find ways to remove it. Very cumbersome. With electric, you unplug it, you maintain the reels. So kind of a new experience for the customers using those machines. Staying on the implement side, because a lot of the early work was in task control, this is actually a breakthrough innovation, and if you don't recognize this is a planter for planting seed. And historically, I think from the time of Jethro Tull, planting seed took place by having a mechanism that singulated seeds and then dropped them through a gravity tube, gravity-driven tube that pulled the seed down into the ground, friction on the surface of the tube, and the seed falls into the furrow. And as a result of that approach of just dropping the seed, it really limited the speed at which you could plant. You could plant up to about 5.5 miles per hour. Somebody developed the concept of, well, why don't we carry the seed from the meter all the way to the ground? And that was a great concept, but it wasn't possible without electrification. So this planting unit, this vertical piece here is a brush belt that catches the seed as it's singulated, which is driven by an electric drive, and then takes that seed precisely to the ground. And with this capability, you can match the placement of seeds to give variable seed spacing across different rows. And actually, it was able to deliver the seed consistently at consistent spacings up to 10 miles an hour versus 5.5 miles an hour. So I'll give you a few examples to see this one. This is what it looks like when you have a collection of them. So planters can have different widths. It can be 24 row, it can be 48 row. And in this particular case, by having electrification, precision control of seed spacing for each row unit, consistent placement across a speed range, and that was driven by this dropping the seed. If you went too fast, the spacing between seeds varied, and so the coefficient of variation created changes in the growth environment. So it's really important to keep them consistent. So as an example, a 60-foot planter traveling 8.5 miles an hour can now plant 60 acres per hour. And that's just amazing. If you think about farmers dealing with climate change and trying to get their crops planted in the spring between two storms, and they just had this window of opportunity, this is everything to them. So I'll give you a little video of what this looks like. You'll be able to see the system. The furrow is opened by disc coulters, and then the seed is coming down this brush belt. And consistent spacing. You can change the spacing on the go. One of the problems historically with ground-driven planters is if you turn to radius, the row units on the outer radius would have a different spacing than inner radius, but that's completely being able to be corrected with this type of technology. And so just to give you an idea of the outcome of this for customers is that you have this field of crops that are planted at the desired spacing, all of them perfect. There's no overlaps of plants, and it just gives this beautiful seed bed and start for growing the crop and increasing yield and all kinds of aspects of that. Now, so implement function sounds really great, but one of the things with ag equipment in particular is that it's driven with a tractor that's a power unit and an implement that isn't often made by the company that builds the tractor. And so one of the challenges is how do you deliver that functionality for other OEMs that develop the implements? In this case, it's an example of a collaboration with a fertilizer distributor, RAL, and the benefits of electrification is that they basically have a spinning disc that distributes fertilizer, but the ability to change and apply the fertilizer at different rates is enabled by electrification because you essentially have an independence of the tractor speed, the PTO, and the hydraulic systems. And now that does require one of the areas of challenges for the industry. It requires coordination to make sure that we have power takeoff shaft as a common standardized unit. We talked about standards earlier. Well, in this case, there's a need for electrification standards to emerge. And I agree with Martin's comments yesterday, especially with respect to batteries, because it's a very dynamic space. But this is also a challenge where we have to have consistent connectors working together, and it is really important the industry develops them. Now, and one of the other problems that's really interesting here is that smaller OEMs, you know, if you're transitioning to a new technology like electrification, you may not have any people that do this. And so earlier there was a comment about the need for services. There is an opportunity for organizations to provide those types of electrification services while small organizations build their own capabilities. Now, if you have a machine where you don't have to have attachments connected to it, like a wheel loader, you have more control over it. It's within the control of the company. This is a mild hybrid, and it has an electric powertrain, still has a diesel engine. It has independent wheel motors in each wheel, and there's this propulsion side of it is decoupled from the hydraulics. You have these working independently, and it delivers quite a different experience. I think there's alternative configurations that could be used in delivering this powertrain. But what's really interesting with this configuration is the possibility of being able to sense the torque in each wheel and be able to use that as you're trying to load the bucket as full as you can as you dig into a pile of aggregate and other materials. A couple of more pictures on this. The real customer benefit of this is that it maximizes productivity and provides power efficiency. The construction world is very concerned about their low daily operating cost and productivity and other factors. Electrification is a way of providing fuel savings, and as I mentioned in the previous slide, there is a potential for using the advanced traction control to deliver future features and functionality that are based on automation. So a couple of future solutions here, and these are concepts that have been shown publicly, and but it may not be. Some of them may be heading to production. I don't know that, but the visibility of them to see the benefits is out there. And you know, going back to the implement side, we were talking about the implement functionality. But there's been a long debate around the idea around, a tractor has kind of this history of being a tow implement. It's a delivers draft, the draft comes from the implement, but it delivers the power that helps provide the moving that implement around the field or that system. What about the idea of having them work together as an integrated solution? And a powered axle is possible with electrification. So you can have electrification produced on the tractor, and then at the same time, for implements, if they have powered axles, you can have the system work together. And there's a lot of benefits of that. Agriculture has varying terrains, and the opportunity to be able to have the implement help pull itself up the hill is a possibility in this particular configuration. So this tractor has a EIVT transmission. It's electromechanical power split. It's provisioned to provide 100 kilowatts of electricity, electrical power for implement consumption. And as I mentioned, some of the benefits are being able to improve traction, reducing slip, improving the guidance on slopes where you can use differential steer to keep the implement and the whole vehicle system on track. Okay. Is somebody have a, oh, here we go. There's a message on my screen, sorry. This is a emerging concept that shows battery electric in agriculture. And you see the conversations around this often have battery electric, autonomous, and smaller as part of the system. And I think that's maybe a reasonable way to think about the possibilities for this to work today. Monarch is heading towards producing an all-electric tractor, 10 kilowatt to 40 kilowatt hour battery pack, depending on the application. Technologies such as autonomy, remote control, data analytics to increase the efficiency and productivity. You can get 10 hours on a single charge and can be charged using standard electrical outlets or level 2 EV charger. And so these types of things are on the way. And another example that showed up at CES this year was the idea of an excavator that can be battery electric. Actually, Brian talked about this in his presentation, the concept of being able to be inside of a shopping mall and doing work and having low emissions, no emissions, quieter to the extent that the work is getting done, but no background noise of the engine. And you're starting to see in this space that there are providers of, or the OEMs are developing battery systems and thinking about charging. And as Brian mentioned in his conversation, the idea of even huge charging infrastructure that can be on the work site is within the scope of possibilities. And these last three examples, I'm not going to go through them, but just to show there's been a lot of different types of thinking that may result in new machine forms in the future. This one on the left is a battery electric tractor, but the cab is actually detachable. In fact, the cab has a hitching system that if you want to ride in it, you can pick up the cab and you can go out and do the work. And if you don't need the cab, it can be an autonomous vehicle that can work independently. Actually, I think I saw the example was where they placed the cab at the side of the field and the vehicle moved around while the operator sat in a nice, comfortable station and didn't have to ride on the equipment. Grid connected is probably the hardest to get your mind wrapped around, but this was actually a system that could effectively cover a fairly significant size, maybe, well, not in Midwestern terms, but 10, 20 acres, and it had enough power cord to reach back to the power source, and it had intelligence enough to lay the cord out of the way and then reel it up and roll it out and do that type of thing. So that's an interesting concept. And then also a lot of the times you see electrification, you see autonomous. So you start taking all of these systems off of a vehicle, and what you really are left with is a propulsion system that provides the ability to tow and implement through the field. So let's talk a few moments about the farm of the future. And I'm actually back working on a project that's trying to think about circular bioeconomy. But this is a quote from George Washington Carver in 1930s. And you think about this is just when we're getting electrification, back to my earlier comments. And we also already have mechanical systems in the field. And his comment was that the benefits we get from having petroleum fuels allows us to do some things that we couldn't do otherwise. And we are getting in a phase as we start thinking about all companies that previously talked about their sustainability objectives. We're having to learn how to do things new ways, and how can we synthesize materials that we need for human flourishing from things that we grow. And so actually there is a need to perhaps say, do we want to do this off of the current grid that we have today? Or is there an opportunity to transform the grid to one that makes this more of a possibility into the future? And I strongly believe that electrification is a key part of our journey to sustainable agriculture. And I know NAE has had several reports that have been prepared on the future electrical grid. My point here is that we often think about it from the needs of the transportation system or the needs from industry. From all the speakers that talked in the previous session, it's really important for us to take a more comprehensive view as how do we take advantage of this in agriculture, marine, aerospace, and all of these systems. And it's likely to be a very dramatically different system by integrating all of those pieces. In the case of agriculture, we have a linear bioeconomy today, and we want to think about making it a more circular bioeconomy. And electrification will be key to making that possible. We can go ahead and take steps today to make machinery more efficient, to be more sustainable, and we should do that type of thing. There's an opportunity on farms in particular to leverage e-fuels produced from crops that we grow on the farm, solar and wind, as ways of collecting, generating power for the applications. And we also need to consider alternative forms of the grid or microgrid that can support climate-smart agriculture. And there's other ideas. I believe this is something that there are lots of innovations for rural electrification that lead to climate-smart agriculture, and this is a great time for us to start having a discussion around them. So my last slide is off-road equipment electrification has advanced in agriculture and off-road, in particular because it's created the unique customer value today. But we now are driven by more sustainability benefits as being a key factor. And so I think there's a real opportunity to accelerate this. Electrification is one critical element that helps lead to this aspect of a circular bioeconomy. And I believe that strategies for evolving the grid need to include the unique needs of agriculture and food production as part of the narrative. Thank you.
Fantastic, John. Do we have some questions? We have plenty of time. Yes.
It's a type of question I'm asking that you asked last time. What does it mean that electrification, the cost-wise, the cost-wise, how much benefits to them?
Well, and it depends on if you're talking about, yeah, okay, but what I would say is it depends on whether you're, oh, okay. The question was, I asked questions whether the customer benefits for this, and I think in the case of, I showed a couple of examples like the wheel loader, it's fuel savings. And that's a big driver for customers. They still have an internal combustion engine, but electrification leads to more power efficiency across the machine system. And that's something that they will pay for if they can get that savings. Actually, the opportunity, I was going to ask this question, is about maintenance costs, but electrification, all signs are that the support and maintenance of these systems is improved over other types of systems, maybe even potentially doubling the life of the powertrain system in some cases. The challenges for customers will be things like batteries. They're not slam dunk today that you can just take those, but I believe we have to kind of work through those and understand how do we address those challenges like we have for cars, the range anxiety and those aspects as well. But in some cases, being able to, agriculture in particular has been built on big, wide mechanical systems, and today we're into more precision ag. And electrification is a key way of achieving the control and performance, and it gives that capability that's beyond. Other technologies contribute, including connectivity and automation and control, but electrification provides high precision control that is hard to replicate otherwise. Yes.
Yeah, John. You talked a little bit at the very end about the windmills and wind turbines and solar, et cetera. I think I mentioned to you last night that from one side of my family, there's a 60,000 acre ranch in Colorado. They put up 72 wind turbines. But it seems to me, when I talk to them, if you look at the annual P&L sheet for any ranch or farm, generating power by either wind or solar is a way to help dampen out the vagaries caused by weather and sorts of other things. So and there's certainly a lot of land, especially as you get further west into ranching country, even than here in the Midwest. What do you see as the long-term trajectory for putting more wind, and especially wind, because it doesn't interfere with anything else? The cattle don't really care about the wind turbines.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think the one thing that, I don't necessarily know the answer to that question, but I do know that I have some concerns about taking arable cropland, which is not going to grow, and how we integrate renewables like wind and solar into them is pretty important to think about. Do we take productive land and cover it so it's non-productive? Can we integrate productivity in with the production systems? Can we just take the available surfaces that we have on farms anyhow and provide value that the farm can be more sustainable for those types of systems? And I believe there's, Brian had an interesting comment that I imagined an agricultural field having a Caterpillar giant truck show up that's a battery system that's needed just to help get the crop planted because we need short-term power availability in rural communities, and the infrastructure doesn't exist for it. So I think this is a really interesting systems engineering problem, and it's important to really bring all sides of this together and not just keep expanding from a technology perspective. We may miss the opportunity here to really build a more integrated social ecosystem.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Next, we'll be hearing from the Illinois Department of Transportation. We have two speakers. We have Holly Bieneman, who is the director of the Office of Planning and Programming at the Illinois Department of Transportation. She works directly with the Secretary on multi-year, multimodal programs, research efforts, and innovative program delivery. She holds a BA in Public Administration and Economics from Northern Illinois University, and an MA in Public Policy and Administration from Northwestern University. And she's joined by Elizabeth Irvin, who is a Deputy Director in the Office of Planning and Programming at IDOT, focused on implementing sustainable innovations, including the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, the NEVI program, and Carbon Reduction Program. They'll be sharing this, and they'll be joining the panel, which will follow, where we'll hear from a broader section of government. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're all staying dry. Very happy to be here, and I know we're probably your last session before lunch and the end of the conference, so we'll try to keep it interesting. But my name is Holly Bieneman. Thanks for the great introduction, and we have Elizabeth Irvin here. We're going to tag team this presentation. It's titled Preparation for Mobility Electrification. We've been talking about this for a long time, but we're finally getting to a place where we're taking action. So today we just plan on talking about our progress on electrification, our early days, our needs identification, and then some of the actions we're taking currently or that have happened, along with next steps. So in the early days, vehicle electrification has been around for almost a decade now, if not longer. We, like most things, at state government have been getting the question, this is happening, what are you doing about it? And we kept hearing it. We heard it from advocacy groups who, wanted electrification of the transportation system, and then other transportation professionals such as yourself, academia, EVs are coming, CAFE standards are increasing. What is the department going to do about it? And like most things, it's difficult to take action, especially when, we're worrying about the snowstorm that's coming. So, we did our best to prepare. We definitely had eyes on it. We definitely were thinking about it. But I also want to point out that another, a major funding source for the department and the transportation construction that we do and operating that we do is the motor fuel tax, and that's collected on a per mile gallon tax. So you have kind of like these competing interests because, we of course have a goal of sustainable initiatives and addressing climate change as we can and those types of things. And then it's like, well, our funding's going to decline. So how do we handle both, right? So that was another thing that was, in the early days kind of being discussed. At least it was in our minds. So some early actions were coordination. We have, and you're going to hear about this on the panel quite a bit, we first initiated some interagency coordination when it sounded like there was going to be some funding behind EV charging, EV adoption. We started an interagency coordination effort. We meet every 2 weeks, and I think there's 8 state agencies. At least. We have IDOT, Environmental Protection Agency, Commerce and Economic Opportunity, Illinois Commerce Commission, who has jurisdiction over the utilities, Central Management Services, which manages like our fleet, our buildings, our purchasing, the Illinois Finance Authority. There are so many agencies that touch electric vehicle adoption within the state of Illinois. And so we all had to get together, and we still meet every 2 weeks to discuss initiatives. External coordination, we had a lot of folks out there saying, what are you doing about EVs? And of course, it was also kind of collaborative with autonomous vehicles. And so breaking those apart and making it clear, like EV doesn't mean AV, right? And AV doesn't mean EV. And making sure we're focusing on the electric vehicles through the external coordination. We participated with our metropolitan planning organizations and then any like council of governments that were interested. We also started to fund, because we are a big funding agency, right? We have money and we grant it to do research or studies or plans. We started to fund, like a certain county's EV adoption plan, so they can start preparing for EVs as they come in. So those were some of the first actions. Other actions, hiring. We had no staff dedicated to this. I'm sure you all are in the same position that we are, where it's hard to find staff. But some other states, specifically Minnesota and California, had already had a director of sustainable initiatives, and their one job was to focus on sustainable initiatives within the department. Now that includes, at IDOT, that includes EV, but that includes a lot of other things too. So before we had brought on Elizabeth, which we're so happy she is here to work to focus on these things, we kind of handled it as other duties as assigned. If there was an employee who showed interest in, greening of our buildings, or we were able to give them some space to work on that. But like I said, other states, Minnesota specifically, was an inspiration to develop a position for a director of sustainable initiatives, essentially. And so in the Office of Planning and Programming, we were fortunate enough to have a job position that could be repurposed for that. We advertised for it, and Elizabeth is now in there, so we're very excited about that. We also, in Illinois, like I said, there's a lot of agencies that touch electric vehicle adoption, electric vehicle encouragement, and some state legislation that I'll talk about next identified that a statewide EV coordinator had to be hired, and we have Mega Lectura. She is our statewide EV coordinator, and she is with the the Environmental Protection Agency. But we work with her regularly. So there's a lot of legislation too in Illinois. Rebuild Illinois, which is significant for capital, especially at IDOT and across the state, had $70 million for EV charging set aside for the Environmental Protection Agency to administer, among other things. CEJA, the Climate and Equitable, I put the wrong up there. It's Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, not Clean Energy Jobs Act. That is my bad. Identified that we have to hire a statewide EV coordinator, which I just mentioned is Mega. It also identified that the department has to conduct a revenue study, because as EV adoption increases and CAFE standards increase, that our revenue is going to decline. And so that's something that we've been working on. And then, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the federal infrastructure bill, IIJA or BIL, has the NEVI program. So I'm going to turn it over, or these are some high-level actions, planning, research that we've been working on with U of I. Their research program with Dr. Al-Khadi was something looking at EV adoption statewide. NEVI is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. Like I said, we've been giving out local grants. And then we also, local grants to local jurisdictions to study EV adoption, along with the revenue study. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth because she's the one doing the work, which we're very appreciative of, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Holly. So I started at IDOT on July 1st, so it's been a very busy 9 months. We've been doing a lot of good work and kind of setting the stage for an even busier few years ahead as we move forward into really trying to get this infrastructure, particularly on the charging infrastructure side, into the ground and try to solve some of that chicken and egg problem between people being worried about buying an EV until there's enough infrastructure out there to support people's long distance travel. So a big piece of this is the NEVI program implementation. We did our plan over, we submitted that on August 1st and got our approval in September. We've been working since then on kind of refining the details, learning more from the federal rulemakings and requirements that was just finalized. Folks may be aware, about a month ago, we got our final rules on the NEVI program requirements from the federal government, as well as information on Buy America requirements. There's a lot of learning going on. As someone in a meeting that I was in with a bunch of the states talking about our lessons learned, they mentioned we shouldn't call anything a best practice yet. They're just practices. Because we haven't gotten to the stage where we really know the best ways forward. We're all experimenting, we're all learning as we go. But it's really an exciting time. As a piece of that, we're working on a request for information to get some more information from charging providers and as well as potential site hosts for these charging stations, because we think a lot of them are going to be not on at rest stations or on public land, but a lot of them are going to be in places where people kind of want to stop and take a break. So a gas station, a retail parking lot, something there where there's things to do, like good lighting, other people around. So we're hoping to learn more from that as we kind of work to finalize the details of our first round for funding for this program. We're planning to release that, put that out for applications late this summer, early fall. We are also working on, as Holly mentioned, this revenue report, which is looking at the impacts of electric vehicle adoption and potential options to replace that revenue lost. We're wrapping that up now. It should be released in the spring. And we've been talking mostly about the passenger vehicle side, although the last presentation was really interesting. I learned a lot about the agricultural and sort of working vehicle side of things. We're also doing a lot of work at IDOT on medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification, particularly around transit. As folks may know, we do a lot of work with downstate transit agencies on their vehicle purchases. So the part of IDOT that's focused on that has been really working hard to get applications in and plans developed for those smaller transit agencies to make sure they don't get left behind and they can be competitive for a lot of pots of federal funding, such as the Low-No program that provides funding for low-emission buses. We're also, as Holly mentioned, it's super important, the coordination side. We've been working really closely with a lot of other agencies, including IEPA, on understanding sort of the heavy-duty vehicle transition, which is super important in Illinois. We're a big freight state. There's a lot of opportunity for us to be a leader in this space, but it's just a sort of different animal than the private, individual vehicle light-duty side. So we're working closely with others in Illinois as well as with other states in the Midwest on initiatives to try to understand and incentivize low-emission vehicle adoption in the heavy-duty section. I'll also just mention that you should keep an eye on IEPA's website. They are doing rounds of EV rebates. They're also funding some medium and heavy-duty vehicle programs. I think there was just an announcement yesterday, and I don't have the deadline up, but it was for the next round of the VW program, again, for school buses and transit buses. So there's a lot going on at the state, both things that we're kicking off and things that are already underway. And just to reiterate an image that was on Holly's slide earlier, we're still looking for people to do this work, I think, across all of the state agencies. So if you are interested in working for the state, come find us and we can talk to you about that. Or if you know great students, we've got lots of openings. And with that, I think this is our contact information, and we'll turn it back over for questions.
How do you charge people electric vehicles? What does Illinois do charging the electric vehicles or fuel instead of fuel tax? Or as a fuel tax or whatever?
Right, so that's really the key question that's in the revenue study. Yeah, so stay tuned for more detailed information on it. One key thing that was, and Holly, feel free to jump in here, but one key thing was the increased EV registration fee that was part of the Rebuild Illinois. So that's one piece of a solution. But the revenue study really looks at what other solutions are out there, looks at what's going on in other states, and tries to evaluate. It's likely going to need to be a combination of a bunch of different solutions. So let's get some sort of high-level information about what these different revenue source options are. So stay tuned for a more detailed answer on that question.
And I'll just add, the revenue study really just looked at what the impact is going to be, what we anticipate the impact to be under a low, medium, and high adoption rate of electric vehicles. And then it essentially identifies all potential revenue options and evaluates them. It's not making a policy recommendation. It is gathering information to give to our legislators to make that recommendation. And as we mentioned, likely to be published, this spring.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So my question's kind of two-part. One segment of transportation we haven't talked about this week, at least that I've seen, is rail. And I don't know if there's a huge push for any rail things. First of all, I don't know if IDOT is in charge of rail. You mentioned we're a big freight state, and anyone who lives in this town knows there's a lot of freight going through, the railway going right through the center of our town. So I guess my question is, A, does IDOT oversee that, and B, are there any initiatives for that to maybe, I'm just even trying to think in my head what there would be, but maybe how rail would play into this.
I can take a first stab at that. As I mentioned, we're a big funding agency, right? We give a lot of grants out, and we have worked with our non-attainment areas, so the Chicago region and the East-West the Metro East region, to fund diesel retrofits for trains, for freight trains. Those are not necessarily electrification, but I'm not sure of any recent. I know we have different engine standards for trains through EPA, through national EPA, and so we give grants to improve the emissions from that. I think do you know of any other alternative fuel they may be looking at?
Yeah, I think that's the big one is programs like, you may be familiar with the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program, CMAQ, is a source of funding for that. There also may be, I haven't looked as much into the details, eligibility. A lot of the federal programs have, like the Carbon Reduction Program, have explicitly said that freight, particularly like rail yards and ports, are a key source of a potential use of funding. So there's creative ways to use, especially with this new round of funding. There's creative ways to try to address some of those challenges on the freight side.
Okay, let's move on to the panel, and Holly and Elizabeth will continue to be on stage so we can ask more questions. And they'll be joined by Lisa. Okay, we have Lisa Clements Scott. She's with Great. Okay, Lisa Clements-Stott, she's the Electric Mobility Innovation Director. She's with the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. And Paul Faraci, our state senator, we're expecting, anytime we'll expect him here. So let's get started. So maybe Lisa, you just joined the stage, so maybe you could start out with some statement.
Hi, everyone. Lisa Clements-Stott. I am also a new hire. You can see a pattern here that the state is really staffing up in electric mobility. So at DCEO, I am the person in charge of manufacturing incentives. So I'm that member of the team. Mega Lecturer, who Holly and Elizabeth referenced, is kind of the overall guru over all of us. But she really focuses with IDOT on the charging infrastructure side, and I'm definitely the manufacturing any part of the supply chain, for electrification side.
Is having battery problems, so we will swap that. Thank you.
Could you maybe follow up about this electric trains or the rail in Illinois?
I don't really have much to add on the rail side, other than we are looking at companies, rail, airplane was talked about a lot, obviously vehicle, medium, heavy duty. We're looking at all of it. DCO doesn't have a position on the rail policy side, unfortunately.
Let me ask a question from the whole panel. I think, we just touched on rail, and of course we've touched on some highway and other things. Illinois, of course, is well known as a massively multimodal transportation state with massive air infrastructure, highway infrastructure, freight systems, trucking, and so forth. And I know, Lisa, a lot of your job is really to try to make sure that we're enhancing the industry in the state as well as just the usage. And for all three of you, how is that playing out across these different sectors and across the state, in your opinions?
I'll be happy to kick it off. I mean, we do have the REV Act, Reimagining Electric Vehicles, which encourages and identifies incentives, which I'm sure Lisa will talk to. From the department standpoint, we have, I like to share this fun fact, but I think I lose some people with it, just related to the multimodal freight movement within Illinois. We are the third largest mover of freight in Illinois in terms of value and tonnage, right? In the U.S., yes, thank you. So we're the third largest mover. Most states move via truck, right? That is the most common way. In Illinois it is, but we're only about 60% of freight movement by truck, whereas other states are around 80 or 90%. So we are multimodal in that we move via waterways, we can't forget those, rail and air. And so it's, IDOT studies freight movement. We look at, trucks, they emit, they do damage to our pavements. There are a lot of, they move goods, which is something we definitely need. It's an important mode of transportation, but when we're looking at freight movement, we're looking at which one is the most environmentally friendly. And is there a possibility for a commodity to move through those? And so, we're looking at that from like a policy strategy, and then you can also see it where it's funded, right? Like Rebuild Illinois included $150 million for ports, for public ports, to improve our public port infrastructure, which can include purchasing things like electric cranes to get stuff off the ports, off the barges, onto the railroads. Or the trucks. So, you can see where the investment is. We're putting our money and we're putting our decision making behind those sorts of considerations. And then we also have we have certain programs that we look at for encouraging development, such as like our economic development program, whereas if a new company is building or they're expanding or they're modernizing and they're going to create or retain jobs, we're able to provide funding for that. So you see a lot of our policy decisions through how we implement our funding.
And then the one thing that I would add to that from the IDOT side is that we also play a role in both business development and workforce development around both, the contracting that we do and the procurement that we do, and we have a whole part of IDOT that looks at workforce development and business development, ensuring that we've got minority and disadvantaged businesses that can compete for some of this funding. So there's work going on there. We're also working closely with DCEO to try to understand as this new emerging industry comes forward, making sure we've got the workforce and that we're doing the training through apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeship programs, making sure we're building a pipeline that's inclusive and is reaching to all of the state's communities.
I guess what I would add is kind of taking a step back a little bit. If the senator were here, I think he would have a lot to add here. It's very exciting to be working for a governor who comes from tech, who has had a history of investing in these sectors, and so recognizing over a year ago that and I think you're going to get a little bit into top down versus bottom up. Recognizing over a year ago that this is the direction the state needed to move into, with 1 million electric vehicles being our goal by 2030 and 100% clean energy by 2050 as a state. And that was, negotiated by a lot of people, the legislature. It's all codified in Illinois law. We have the reimagining, it's actually energy and vehicles now. Because not only do we give incentives for manufacturers of electric vehicles and component parts, but it's also all the renewables. We're hearing a lot from industry that they want to, to the previous conversation, potentially co-locate solar or wind next to their electric vehicle manufacturing facility. We have CEJA, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, which was referenced earlier. That's also a huge workforce component, $180 million a year that will be spent on training people in the workforce. And then we also have a semiconductor incentives, which are very similar to the REV incentives, because semiconductors are such an important part of this industry as well. So we have all of these different things codified into law that were negotiated for months by many different people. So it's really exciting. We're actually competing now in this sector as far as incentives, as far as planning goes. We have a lot of work to do on the charging infrastructure side to meet the demand, and we don't have very many cars on the road yet toward that 1 million goal. But we've actually been hearing that we're actually competing in the industry. We are bringing utility deals to the table. We are bringing the workforce to the table. That's one place that Illinois really competes. So it's really exciting time for Illinois because we really are at the forefront of this. The Micro Act, the semiconductor incentives, and the REV incentives happened long before there was any federal funding in these packages, in these recent packages. Illinois was one of the first states to set the bar on that. So we are feeling very optimistic right now.
Thank you. I'd like to ask another question. So John was mentioning about how electrification can increase precision, like precision in agriculture. I think that could also increase precision on our highway system. And then Elizabeth said EV is different than AV. Okay, electric vehicle and autonomous vehicles. I just want to ask a little bit more about the AV and see about the state, any programs for like experimental 1 mile of AV in the trucking, maybe possibly tied with electrification.
Sure, I'll go ahead and answer that. So we might be a little more in those early stages of autonomous vehicles are coming, and what is the department going to do? Because autonomous vehicles could have significant impacts on our transportation system as a whole, right? Do you need parking garages anymore if they can just drive around? There are tons of things that we have to think about related to that, the same way we have to think about EVs. And, at the department, we have been evaluating legally what can be done on our roadways within current existing legislation to make sure we're following the rules of course, and we know what those constraints are if there is testing going on. Some companies have reached out to us and wanted to do testing, and we evaluate those on an as-come basis. Now, this is another thing similar to EVs that touches so many different agencies, right? Now you have Secretary of State involved who provides licenses and manages, the regulations of the roads, and us considering it from an infrastructure perspective, a safety perspective, and an operational perspective. We are the ones putting the lines on the road and the guardrail up and the signs, and so we have. You hear a consistent theme from me. We have provided funding for studies. We have provided funding for research to allow entities to look at this, and then we keep our finger on the pulse because we want to be aware of what is going on and make that next step when appropriate.
And the one thing that I would add is, and also as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a big research study that's going on with a stakeholder group from industry and academia and advocates and state DOTs that is looking to provide some more guidance on a lot of these areas. Because as with EVs, all of the states are having internal conversations. We're all trying to learn from one another. So I'm looking forward to seeing those recommendations come out. I think that'll be really helpful.
I know the legislature has some bills that were introduced this year that are maybe more cautious than maybe the industry would want. We're definitely listening to the industry about, keeping the innovation forward, not tying their hands. That the OEMs are all working on this. And, fans of U of I's autonomous track and all the possibilities for testing here in central Illinois. So it is definitely emerging. And I think from a Department of Commerce point of view, we're also listening to what the industry wants a lot.
Boy, let's open it up. We have our student runners with a microphone. So if you have a question, please hold up your hand and they'll get your microphone so that we can get everybody to hear and get it on track here. Yeah.
You said that you have a whole bunch of programs to provide incentive and subsidies, etc. What kind of response did you get from the private sector?
When REV was first passed, it was a lot of tax credits and tax exemptions, and there's real value in the REV program. But definitely, we started hearing last summer that upfront capital costs were the real driver. This industry across the nation is the most competitive industry right now, and we were getting there, but we were not cutting it. So in the last 6 months, we have added a lot of grant support, straight up grant support to Illinois' packages. So for example, we have grants to partner with the community college on workforce, on the local workforce area for workforce, but we also have 3 pots of money to go to companies for upfront capital costs. That's our Prime Sites grant, our Enterprise Fund grant, and the most exciting is the Invest in Illinois grant, which is the governor's closing fund, discretionary fund, $400 million that the legislature gave us in January. So, the last several, the other way to look at it is our pipeline went from, I think, 3 REV prospects that came into the pipeline asking, what the incentives would be last summer to more than 20 just in the first month of this year. So that closing fund has made a huge difference in the amount of companies in the pipeline. So I'm hoping that you'll hear a lot of announcements in the next 2 months. Our first REV announcement was Indicator. The TCCI is an EV compressor, international compressor company. So they've actually received our first REV incentive, and we're going to hopefully announce a whole bunch more this year.
And then I'd say on the EV charger side, we've gotten huge amounts of interest in the NEVI program. It's a really great deal in terms of it's a 20% federal match for building these charging stations and sort of building out a network. We're getting a lot of interest both from the charging companies and from potential site hosts, gas stations, municipalities who are really interested in this. I've often said I could spend my entire day doing nothing but talking to all the people who are interested in learning more about this program, which is great. It's a great problem to have. And so I think the biggest challenge has been that the NEVI program itself has a lot of sort of technical requirements and sort of particular rules about where stations can be. And so the challenge has mostly been kind of explaining to people how this all works. So we've been keeping busy doing that, but I think we're going to get a lot. And the states that have started to roll out their first round of applications have gotten huge demand. So it's exciting. Good problems to have.
My question may be out of scope of what you focus on, but we had an earlier conversation about the digital thread, and it seems like electrification, you don't even really think about it unless you think about the vehicles connected, because the information is very valuable in managing the overall ecosystem. Does connectivity play into your focus?
So we've been talking a lot to the utilities and to it's called the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation at the federal government about cybersecurity issues and thinking through some of these pieces, because the charging infrastructure likely will be connected so that people can use a smartphone to pay, that sort of thing. Whether it's capable of connecting to the grid, it sort of depends on the charger, and I'm definitely not an expert in these details, so don't take engineering specs from my answers. But it's a key area that we've been looking at and learning from experts in this area, and learning from experts in some of the other state departments who have really been focused on this for a long time. So it's a key thing that we are working to figure out how to incorporate in our contracting for these stations.
Imai, go ahead.
Yeah, I have two questions, actually. Excuse me. The first one is the state of Illinois has just completed a plan for the EV, and it will be nice if you can just give us an idea about what has been completed. The second question is, in the panel with the industry this morning, there was a good discussion about that the innovation and the development is going much faster than developing standards. And given that the standards and policies usually coming from the government, it's good to give you the opportunity to give your opinion on that.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about a couple of different. There are lots of EV plans that because it's moving so fast. So I'll talk about two, and then maybe Lisa, if you want to, I don't know if there's anything you want to share on that front. So we have the state electric vehicle infrastructure deployment plan, and that was a requirement for the NEVI program. That was submitted in August. And that really outlines how the state plans to spend the NEVI funding. It's a 5-year program, so we'll be doing updates to those plans. We haven't, to your other point, haven't gotten the information from the federal government yet about what they would like to see in that plan update. So we are eagerly awaiting that clarification. So that's one piece, which is sort of outlining where are the key places we need to build infrastructure in order to meet the NEVI requirements. We also did a really helpful study that actually started earlier, working with you all, working with Dr. Cantu, and I think there might have been a presentation earlier yesterday, talking a little bit about taking a more holistic view of the state and our goals in CEJA about getting to 1 million EVs on the road. And trying to identify both sort of where is there most need for investing in charging infrastructure across the state and along the corridors, and also really taking an equity perspective as we think about this infrastructure, there are places where there are already the cars, there's already the demand, and so there's sort of a market there. There's also places where the cars aren't there yet, and the infrastructure is going to be necessary to make people comfortable, either people who live in that community or people who are driving through, on their way along the road. Particularly since in a lot of communities, if you don't own your own house, if you're renting, you live in a multifamily dwelling, you might have an older car. Once we get farther along in this transition and people have older EVs that have smaller range batteries, there's a lot of considerations from an equity perspective to making sure that as this transition happens, it happens across the state and it benefits all of our communities. So we're taking lessons learned from those and incorporating them into our work going forward.
We maybe have time for one more question. So I'll ask it. Oh, no. Okay, yeah. Go ahead. Karuba.
Well, thank you for sharing all the different programs that Illinois has. And I get the sense that there's maybe some healthy competition between states. So I'm curious about any efforts at coordinating between the DOTs, adjacent states, setting up a hub in the Midwest.
Yeah, so definitely there's healthy competition, but also an acknowledgement that we all need to learn from each other. We've been meeting pretty regularly with other state DOTs. We had a conference just maybe a month or two ago with the Midwestern states to kind of share what we're learning and the challenges. We meet pretty regularly over Zoom. We also have some initiatives that are multi-state around the expansion of electric vehicles. So there's Rev Midwest, which is an organization of a number of states, and I'm not going to be able to name them all off the top of my head. But it's Midwestern states that are looking to coordinate around EV adoption, and particularly also trying to look at medium and heavy-duty EV adoption. So that's one initiative that's been moving forward, and we've been meeting really regularly with states to try to coordinate and make our efforts greater than the sum of their parts. The other one that was an announcement maybe 6 months ago now is the Lake Michigan, the states around Lake Michigan, and making sure that we've got a corridor for EV charging for people who are tourists. So working on that coordination as well. So yes, both competition and an acknowledgement that we all need to learn from each other and work with each other.
And I would say you don't really find departments of commerce working together that much. But I thought this was a good moment to highlight, it's a fairly new venture, many more details to be announced, but the governor is leading Innovate Illinois, which is our private-public partnership to get more than Illinois' fair share of federal funding, speaking of wanting to compete and not, looking for academic partners, industry partners on all of the federal applications through EV, semiconductor, and tech, and all along the pipeline. So,
Thank you very much to our panelists. Great session.
All right, just a little bit more. Don't stand up. It's not quite lunch yet. It will be in a moment. But I would like to invite John Anderson and Al Romig back up to say a few closing remarks, and then we will move on to the next part of our program.
I'd like to congratulate the University of Illinois and all the individuals responsible for this outstanding meeting, and had everything in it that you could ask for. I certainly learned a lot, but I've also met a lot of people here. This is what these regional meetings are intended to do, and bring people together, and I think it has succeeded very much. And as an alumnus of the University of Illinois, I'm very proud of what's going on here, and Thank you. And the only regret I have is I haven't found time to hit the Murphy's Pub, but I might try to make that before I get out of here, because I have to tell you that I had a softball team when I was a PhD student here in 1970, and we opened up Murphy's Pub. We were the first participants in the pub, let's say. So I might try to get back. But thank you very much, all of you, and especially Phil, who's done a tremendous amount of work here, and all the staff. And now Al Romick, our executive officer and NAE member, will make a presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And let me just echo what John said. I think it was a wonderful meeting, and you can tell here we are, second day right before lunch, and there's still a decent-sized crowd in the room. And yesterday it was really packed out. But we have something for you, Phil. Come on up. Thank you.
Thank you, Al.
So what I just did is I just gave Phil a copy of a National Academy of Engineering Challenge coin. So there's two stories behind challenge coins if you're not used to. If you've been around the defense industry, you know what they are. But the origin of these, there's an Army and an Army Infantry and an Air Corps version that goes back to World War I, a British and American version. I'll tell you the American Airman just to keep it simple. But an American airman was shot down behind the enemy lines, and when he made his way back to the American lines, he didn't have any identification. He couldn't prove that he was an American. And so the center challenged him to produce a silver dollar, which he could do, and then they allowed him back across the line. What happens today, so Phil, pay attention to this. The next time I see Phil, and we happen to be in a bar, and I put down my coin, if he doesn't have his, he's buying. If it turns out he does, then I'm buying. That's the way it goes. So thank you, Phil. It was a tremendous job.
Okay, thanks to everyone for being here. The next event is indeed lunch with the buffet in the next room. And at that point, we are actually closed, and we're not going to do any official closing. But for those of you interested in paying attention to the program, you will notice that there's an opportunity to tour the Power Optimization of Electrothermal Systems, POETS, Research Center, which is literally about 100 feet from this room, just behind the conference center here. And also, our Research Park Director is intending to join us for lunch, and she would like to be able to lead anyone who'd like to have a broader tour of the University of Illinois Research Park. So those will begin as lunch wraps up at about 1, strictly informal. And other than that, I hope you've enjoyed the couple of days of sessions and very much appreciate your attendance. And we look forward to lots of impact in this field in the future. Thank you.